I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. And again, very happy to do what little I can to remind everyone and to excavate for everyone as much as possible the remnants of the shattered and assaulted image and history of the very real and revolutionary Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And to do that, especially in light of our recent investigations, that's too strong a word, in light of our recent review of Earn Your Leisure and 19 Keys on Drink Champs. And if you haven't seen that, definitely join if you aren't already the channel and check the members only discussion of that. But I was reminded of something in preparing for, I think I'm going to be on a panel in the coming weeks regarding Dr. King. And we always like to revisit Dr. King here. But in preparation, I was reminded in conjunction with that Drink Champs episode of what it really means to be a thought leader. And to be clear, borrowing from the authors that we're going to talk about in this edition, Dr. King was no thought leader.
The court's top thought leader.
So I'm talking about the book we've referenced. The link is already in the show description to the last time I did a discussion of a section of this book. We're going to do a shorter discussion of a shorter section of this book today. Prophet of Discontent by Andrew Douglas and Jared Loggins. Another piece to Jared Loggins, another co-member of the Resuscitate and Revive, speaking of abused names and legacies, of the name Jared. We're trying to, I don't know if he was aware of our existence in this community of saviors of the name Jared, which has taken a beating over the last couple of years. But he and I are there. So, but anyway, want to talk a little bit about that in this episode today. So that's what we're going to do in an honor of King and the legacy of all of our fallen heroes and sheroes and everyone else, and the ongoing abuse of this man, the most known and least understood man in world history, second maybe only to the historical Jesus Christ. Maybe. If we take the real person, or lack thereof, if we take the real person and compare that person to the recreated and reimposed image since, posthumously in each case, I don't know that any person could rival Dr. King or Jesus Christ. Peace be unto his name, and he'll need it, as Dr. John Henrik Clarke used to say. Anyway, so let's do that. Let's get into it. So as you see here from the same book, chapter 2, The Other America, on the method of dissatisfaction. Again, and we're talking about Prophet of Discontent, Martin Luther King Jr., and the Critique of Racial Capitalism by Andrew Douglas and Jared Loggins. Again, in the show description is a link to the last time I tried to address this book on some level. And so please check that out. And a link also to the full catalog of Dr. King content that I've been involved in and we've been involved in producing for 20 years now. There's a lot of work, including my own work on the press and its coverage of him, the erasure of his radical politics. There's a lot of that. Myself, panels, conversations, full day-long events that we put together at Morgan State a couple of years ago. All of that is linked in the show description. So there's a lot of Dr. King content available to you just here alone, never mind all that actually exists out in the world, part of which is covered in this book here. And I want to say also from the outset that all due respect to the studies, the students of philosophy, it would be great to see the authors of this book in conversation, maybe with someone more adept than myself in the philosophical world. As you'll see here, a lot involves that goes beyond my expertise and capability. So as we'll focus here, primarily my own sort of narrowed interests around King's presentation in media, and particularly his critique of capitalism, and how that plays in how that false reporting and false coverage and misrepresentation continues on to today. But what got me to really want to, you know, other than it being in preparation for this panel, I think that I'm going to be on, and just talking about King as we do often here at this time every year and more, is what these authors have had to say specifically about about King and being a thought leader.
The court's top thought leader.
All right, so let's dig into this, and I'm glad I found this digital copy, which I'm not going to share. I think I think it's out there for people to get intentionally by the publisher, but I think I'm gonna leave that for folks to find on their own, and encourage as much as possible people to support a traditional purchase of the book, just because I'm not entirely clear also about the setup that they have. I don't want to participate in freely distributing what is not meant to be. But either way, definitely get the book and read beyond what we're going to talk about here today. Is always encouraged. So. What I love about what they do here, overall, of course, is reminding us that Dr. King was a revolutionary, was a radical, far beyond his popular presentation. Again, many of us, of course, went through the stages of, you know, King was fake or soft and Malcolm was real, and that kind of false dichotomy. And then over the years, the more you read and learn, particularly read them and listen to them directly, and then learn more about the context and some of the background, it's very clear how much that dichotomy is a false construction, an encouraged construct. And so what I love what the authors do here in reminding us just of some of that, but then also going again above and beyond what I'm able to handle in looking at the King as a critical thinker, a philosopher, and how he deployed Hegelian dialectics, and as we'll see here, came short in properly understanding or extending those dialectics to Marx, who of course picked up his own dialectical approach largely, or you know, a lot from Hegel. I only read Hegel a little bit once upon a time, a long time ago, and I never, it was too much for me then, and I never kept with it. So I only know of Hegel reading him indirectly, maybe via Marx or someone else, but even then, it's, you know, so that's why I would encourage those who are looking for more on that, who are themselves perhaps not experts, to find a more expert discussion of that, maybe with these authors themselves, than I would be able to handle. But anyway, so just a little bit here. Let's see. Let's do this. Prophets. So this section isn't that long, but I'm not going to, though it's not that long, I'm not going to obviously read the entire thing, but there are a couple points here that I wanted to highlight that I think are just fascinating and really helpful as again, we're reminded, and I'm saying here, particularly in the context that this discussed here, that Dr. King was not a thought leader. And we see and we know
the court's top thought leader.
So let's see, I think I got it up here on the page here. Well, just as they write in this first paragraph, toward the end of his life, King began to speak of literally two Americas. One, he said, was flowing with the milk of prosperity and the honey of equality, and was the habitat of millions of people who have food and material necessities for their bodies, culture, and education, for their minds, freedom, and human dignity for their spirits. The other has a daily ugliness about it that transforms the buoyancy of hope into the fatigue of despair. King would go on to say that probably the most critical problem in the other America is the economic problem. As we work up a diagnosis of the economic problem, it will be helpful to establish some methodological context. What does it mean for King to expose the other America? How did he bring himself into critical contact with racial capitalism's underside? In what ways did he court and counsel his sense of dissatisfaction? All right, so that's what they're doing in this chapter, looking into King's engagement with the two Americas, as was recently described at that time by the KernerCommission. I'm going to have to add and I'll make sure it's in the show description, some of my own recent work around the KernerCommission that I think will, I don't know, be a nice little supplement to this discussion at some point, perhaps. But anyway, moving ahead here a little bit. In a discussion of James Tully, and Tully, I don't know James Tully's work, but he's referenced here. As the authors here write, but we begin with the figure engaged in what James Tully calls public philosophy as a critical activity, or what a young Karl Marx referred to as simply the self-clarification of the struggles and wishes of the age. The idea is that a meaningful social and political theorizing does not detach itself from the lives and struggles of ordinary people, but is rather a kind of methodological extension and critical clarification of the practical reasoning that historically situated actors already engaged in. So what I love about this section, again, and dovetails with my own hope for my own and our collective work here at BPM, with engagement as public philosophers and intellectuals, and engaging the Black public sphere, which is going to be a theme, a point and theme we come back to. This is beginning to address my own hopes for what we're doing, and how I certainly see and think we should see and agree with the authors here in seeing Dr. King. King, for his part, worked toward a methodological extension and critical clarification of the struggles and wishes of the other America. He sought to model a public intellectualism in service of a Black radical counterpublic. A Black radical counterpublic. That is exactly what I just want to see and have hoped for, and am seeing slowly germinate here at BPM. And certainly we want to support the existing Black counterpublics. Not that one doesn't already exist, but we certainly want to help expand that, organize it, radicalize it. And I love the way they discuss this in terms of Dr. King and what he was doing as well, which is, again, which will be something we come back to throughout, is something that is obviously not encouraged, and certainly not something that we see often in the Black punditry space.
The courteous top thought leader.
Oh man. Yeah, that's definitely going to be the theme. You'll see why more. It'll become more clear if it isn't already shortly. And I love what the authors here do with that. As they say here also, one reason to situate King within a tradition of modern critical theory, at least initially, is that King fashioned himself as a dialectical thinker and a Hegelian of sorts. As such, King was equipped to home in on the complex interrelationships that sustain the social, political, and economic order. He was able to see clearly the ways in which the two Americas are interdependent and condition one another. For us, the signal upshot of recovering King's indebtedness to the dialectical tradition is that it enriches appreciation of King's role as a critic of ideology. It enriches a sense for how King exposed the political motivations behind the ideas and values and structural logics that give legitimacy to the established order. Yeah. Right here at the bottom of that same page, there is no question that King was, as Vincent Lloyd puts it, suspicious of the wisdom of the world ideology. He sought to expose and challenge the dominant ideas and values that obscure unequal social relations. And what I love to what they're building towards is, as we'll see, is this idea that, yeah, a lot of us are quick to say you can't have theory without practice, but we don't consider the opposite or the balance, that without theory, practice is insufficient. And as they argue here, as I interpret what they argue here, practice without theory is hopeless. But we'll see. But I just love how how especially after coming back to reread it once again, I can see the building toward that end. Because as they write here, continuing with Vincent Lloyd. And you all can let me know in the comments if what some of these I have to admit I have not read and not familiar with almost any of the what I'm hoping, I'm assuming are philosophers that or those engaged in dialectical thinking and work. But you all can let me know, what you think of them and how you think these authors have represented those folks. So definitely
put it in the comments.
All right. But again, what Vincent Lloyd says here, King sought to expose and challenge the dominant ideas and values that obscure unequal social relations, what Lloyd calls mystification used by the powerful and wealthy to secure their own interests. And at the end of that paragraph, we fill out a more comprehensive picture of King's critical methodology by showing that his dialectical emphasis on tension and conflict, trained focus, and social relations that are hidden or secreted away rather, not only by the wisdom of the world, not only by the biased or distorted claims of ideological consciousness, but also by the very nature of commercial society. King's critical theory pushes beyond the epistemic to the terrain of the ontological, to a critical confrontation with what Robinson has called the actual being of racial capitalism. So again, as I asked Peter Hudson, last year or whenever we had our interview, about his fascinating work on racial capitalism, the origins and history of that term, going back into Zania, Southern Africa, and the struggle there. I would like to learn more about why racial capitalism as a phrase is preferred to colonialism, colonization, or perhaps some other and I don't know why exactly. I think I just have some sort of issue with racial capitalism as a phrase. I don't know. I just prefer colonialism, or I don't know why we need to. I don't know why. I don't know. Although again, after having that discussion and reading a little bit of Hudson's work, belatedly learning that it has origins that are older than we give it credit for, even that predate even Cedric Robinson. I don't know why. I don't know. So maybe that solves it. Maybe because it is as old as a theoretical approach as internal colonialism or struggle, or maybe not as. I don't know. It's I don't know. It's just something I keep coming back to. But what I really appreciate what they're doing here is that, as they set up, and we'll get to in a moment, is that King was looking to understand the relationship dialectically, as I understand it, and I'm maybe have that incomplete here, the relationship between ideas and the material, not only how they manifest materially, but how the material conditions create those ideas in the first place. And why they make reference, and we'll come back to this issue of the very nature of a commercial society. Throughout the chapter, we draw on the 1968 iteration of King's Other America speech in order to broach and work through several themes relevant to our discussion. As pastor and public intellectual, as a figure who traveled widely and delivered sermons and speeches over and over, King often worked from set pieces. He often repeated himself, and he often improvised on common themes. The Other America was initially a talk at Stanford University in April 1967. Its title phrase clearly a play on Michael Harrington's monumental 1962 book on American poverty. I'm not sure I ever knew that. So that was fascinating. I've certainly not read Harrington's work, so that was fascinating. But as they continue on here, by March of 1968, when King delivered an alternative version to predominantly black labor to a predominantly black labor audience in New York, the phrase would have been resoundingly consistent with the findings of the KernerCommission, which famously concluded that the nation is moving towards two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. King's speech to the 199ers or 1199ers often offers but one window to his thinking about poverty, labor, cross-racial political solidarity, and the Poor People's Campaign, which he had announced in December of 1967, among other themes. It also reveals a later King curiously ambivalent about violent protest, or at least the destruction of property. In other words, correct me if I'm wrong, the text is in front of you, but you can certainly get the full book to read for yourself. But when King was speaking to a black audience, he had a very different, not a very different, but a nuanced, a different emphasis than when he had one, as they talk about, delivered in conversation with working people, rather than at the Stanford crowd. That helps us, as they say, to grapple most generatively with the methodological question. In the face of deep inequality and inequity, in the face of racial worlds that appear all too separate and unequal, how did King and how do we orient and sustain the critical imagination? But I think that's an important point, as King is often misrepresented politically and symbolically, and even by Black capitalists routinely, as someone who supports Black business and Black capitalism as a solution and so on and so forth. King not only did not do that, but King, as they say here, went so far as to say that he was curiously ambivalent about violent protest, or at least the destruction of property. Kind of reminded me of what Kwame Ture said about this whole thing about don't tell Black people not to tear up their neighborhood. They're not destroying property they own. They don't own that property. And that sounds a lot like what they're saying about, similar to what was suggested here about King in his varying discussions or references to the other America that we have out here. Now, did just want to pull up here quickly my own work. I'll put the link if you want to read the whole thing, and it's in the show notes. But in my own work on the KernerCommission, and I did include some of what Dr. King in the SCLC had said in response. So I just wanted to share that a little bit here. On April 2nd, 1968, Dr. King and the leader. And so again, remember the KernerCommission. And again, this article that I've written here goes through the whole history. There's other sources, and I include in the video interviews about it as well. So there's the links that I'll provide have a lot more about this that you can check out on at your convenience. But part of what the KernerCommission was arguing was that there needed to be was that Lyndon B. Johnson styled Democratic Party liberal programs around employment and I can't even remember all the details, but it was sort of the point was that the KernerCommission was even critical of those programs as being insufficient in addressing the tension that leads to racial conflict, as they would have described it, or uprisings in the Black community, which is what the KernerCommission was assembled to assess. So even when Johnson called for the commission to be brought into existence, he ended up hating the report that they delivered, because part of what they were saying was, what you are doing, Johnson, is insufficient and won't really address the problem. But Dr. King and his organization put out a statement 2 days before King was assassinated, that, as I wrote here, King and the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights published their own statement, both in response to Kerner's call to, quote, produce quick and visible progress, and also to challenge a president of which King had already been highly critical. In fact, that is Johnson. In fact, Kerner highlighted for King what he had already made painstakingly clear when noting that cut rate timidity of Johnson's poverty programs, which saw little in comparison to the billions spent for war, were part of the assemblage of hypocrisies leading many to call them out for Black power. The response to call out for Black power, the response to a profound, as King said, disappointment with a federal administration that seems to be more concerned about winning an ill-considered war in Vietnam than about winning the war against poverty here at home. The April 2nd leadership statement took Kerner's words to heart when the KernerCommission declares it's time now to end destruction and violence, not only in the streets of the ghetto, but in the lives of the people. It presents a challenge to the entire nation. It is a challenge that we in the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights willingly accept. The alternatives before the country, as the report presents them, have never been so stark. Either we adopt and implement a national policy that fosters racial and economic integration at every level of American life, or we shall suffer the awful consequences foreshadowed in the report's basic conclusion that our nation's moving towards two societies, one Black, one white, separate and unequal, end quote. 2 days later and 5 weeks after the report's publication, after having assessed him as early as 1963 as the most dangerous Negro of the future of this nation from their standpoint of communism, the Negro, and national security, and after deploying the FBI's counterintelligence program for the purposes of surveillance and engaging in the tactics to neutralize him as an effective leader, and after national media turned him from Man of the Year candidate in 1965 to headlines in 1968 describing Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as a threat to national security, he was assassinated. Like much of the country, Baltimore would erupt in its largest uprising. So what I was writing was in the context of some work around Baltimore and my hopes at the time for developing a research center at Morgan State to address what the KernerCommission had called for and never had been implemented. That is an urban communications research institute. We'll save the story of that project for the Not a Different World HBCU project that I'm working on. And if you are interested in participating in, go to imixwhatilike.org. All right, but that said, the point is that Dr. King was himself critical of the KernerCommission. The KernerCommission was, as brought up here, used to made a reference to the two separate to two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. The other America, the part of what induced King to talk about the other America and lead him to be seen here by the authors we're discussing here. And I would add myself to that list of those recognizing King as a far more radical critical thinker than he's given credit for. By the way, I thought this was also interesting. This little part here about how Dr. King, in talking to that union, the 1199ers, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but it says here, on several occasions, King engaged the membership of the United Healthcare Workers East, the predominantly African-American and Puerto Rican local in New York City, which at one point King identified as his favorite labor union. And in my book, I wrote soda, just putting that out there. I'll just leave that there. But moving right along, the authors bring up HoustonBaker. They make reference to HoustonBaker, who I think is to be credited as one of the, for me, a foundational academic intellectual hater, hater par excellence, and his book Betrayed, about the Black punditry, which is, we're about to come back to this issue of who are the thought leaders, and the context for the problem of thought.
The court's top thought leader.
HoustonBaker's Betrayed was a brilliant takedown of Dyson, Cornel West, everybody, and even if you don't agree with Baker on all accounts, maybe if you even argue, especially at this point, given how many years have passed, for someone like a Cornel West has maybe, I don't know if Baker would agree with this. I haven't paid enough attention, rehabilitated himself. The fundaments, the fundamental, the basis of the argument is I think right on and still relevant, as we'll see as these authors make point to. King was, of course, born into a prominent church family in Atlanta's relatively prosperous, sweet Auburn community, but he was also born a critic whose natural skepticism of both church doctrine and bourgeois society was informed by an unyielding alliance with what HoustonBaker has called the working class Black majority. Now, I'm going to try to draw the distinction, and I would even start now by trying to draw the distinction, but even
the court's top thought leader.
The reason that community is so popular is that they believe themselves to, and they in large part have the ear of a majority of the Black working class community that involves itself in online spaces. So Whereas King in his reality and on a much lower level, myself certainly do not. So I don't know. It's a struggle. But as they say here, foremost in King's critical consciousness, Baker argues, were always those populations of African, African American, Negro, and colored descent in the United States who inhabit the most wretched states, spaces, and places of our national geography. This black majority, this most inevitably exposed, severely policed, desperately under-resourced contingent of the African-American population has become, some 50 years after King's death, indubitably the majority of Afro-America. In order to see King as a critic of racial capitalism and ultimately a theorist of indigenous black radicalism, we must work from the premise that King was in fact no stranger to black workers, the black poor, indeed the black majority in the United States and worldwide. It is also important. Let me make sure this is on. Let me make sure you can see this. It is also important to acknowledge that King would not have considered himself a thought leader as the term is popularly invoked today.
The court's top thought leader.
It is also important to acknowledge. Hold on. It is also important to acknowledge that King would not have considered himself a thought leader as that term is popularly invoked today.
The court's top thought leader.
King never allowed his thinking to be narrowed or subdued by the parameters of investment worthiness. This is the page, this is the paragraph that I was like, this is why we got to talk about it in the context.
The court's top thought leader.
King never allowed his thinking to be narrowed or subdued by the parameters of investment worthiness. He was very explicitly an early critic of the conditions that have made the neoliberal ideas industry possible, including, oh man, this is bars. King never allowed his thinking to be narrowed or subdued by the parameters of investment worthiness. He was very explicitly an early critic of the conditions that have made the neoliberal ideas industry possible, including the empowerment of the plutocratic elite that is able nowadays increasingly surreptitiously through seemingly innocuous TED Talks and the like to commission its intellectual spokespersons to more or less segregate itself from oppositional perspective.
Now listen, that's called my boy. You know nothing about that.
That is bars, and it speaks so perfectly to now they put it into the context of TED Talks. I'm putting it in the context
the court's top thought leader.
Because again, from my humble perspective and my limited work, that's the crowd. The students in my classroom are more likely to hear from
the court's top thought leader
than they are to watch a TED Talk. And I love that these authors are distinguishing Dr. King from the neoliberal ideas industry. So as I've been arguing, the Earn Your Leisures and 19 Keys and all of these folks are carrying a very white, conservative, reactionary, capitalist, colonial, imperialist message wrapped in black working class populism. And it's having a tremendous impact on their targeted audiences, the black community that we are collectively in this counterpublic trying to radicalize. Part of what endures us to the part of what endears us to the King legacy is that that his more comprehensive activist public intellectualism stands in stark contrast to the model of today's neoliberal thought leader.
The court's top thought leader.
And that's who these cats are. They are the neoliberal thought leaders that have stepped into the vacuum created by the assassination of Dr. King and the imprisonment and the assassination of the Black liberation movement and so on and so on and so on, and the current incarceration of political prisoners and so on. So I know I'm having a little bit of fun with keys here and all of that, but in reality, it's not meant to disrespect him in particular or to make him seem that he's all of the font of all the problems. It is to point out that I think he's emblematic of this neoliberal thought leader ideas industry that is meant to produce, well, let's just continue. They're meant to produce and maintain the conditions we are trying to get rid of. Now, I gotta say here, they take a shot at my man Lester Spence. Good old, now this is one professor I do know, Dr. Lester Spence. Used to see him routinely over at the good WEAA in the Mark Steiner show before Mark got removed and replaced, and your boy never able to return. But the Johns Hopkins professor, author, Dr. Lester Spence. As they say here, and while some who might set out to challenge the neoliberal paradigm today might question the import of any public intellectualism, comprehensive or otherwise, we need to drive people to do the hard work needed to take control of the reins of power, insists Lester Spence. And perhaps we do ourselves a service by leaving prophets, even ones like King and public intellectuals, in the past. Wow, I didn't know he said that. However, these authors write, we are not convinced that the problems we face today are so glaringly obvious that the hard work of critical inquiry can be so callously forsaken, or that the reins of power as we know them are worthy of immediate pursuit. Wow. Wow. That's deep. I would have to agree with them, obviously. I haven't read and don't know the context of Spence's full quote. I'm going to take for granted, at least momentarily, that he's being quoted accurately and not out of context. And we would just disagree with the authors of this book. So Lester Spence apparently is saying, hey, look, we don't need, and I get, on a surface level, I get the point. We don't need any more public intellectuals. We need people doing the organizational work, the hard work of revolution. I get that. But to suggest, and this is, I really feel this point, admittedly, around my narrow work on buying power. Because so often the response to me in my work is you don't have any solutions. At least these brothers and sisters are arguing or offering a solution that you may not say is real, but at least is tangible, and we can wrap our minds around it and act in a certain way and maybe even benefit from it. And I'm saying we can't even get to a solution without getting rid of the mythology that inhibits an analysis that would lead us somewhere. I may not have the solution, but I'm arguing we can't even get there if we, in a very anti-intellectual, anti-critical way, embrace this propaganda and don't move past it so that we can get to a solution. And so that seems to be what Spence is saying. We don't need any more public intellectuals, even ones like King. And I agree with the authors here that we are not convinced that the problems we face today are so glaringly obvious. I do think things are a little more nuanced than they're given credit for. And the propaganda encourages so many mythologies and so many misunderstandings and misinterpretations that I think we need more of that work done. The work of critical inquiry, and I don't think that the work of critical inquiry can be so callously forsaken, or that the reins of power as we know them are worthy of immediate pursuit. So the same kind of thing. What is Black capitalists encouraging that we do? Become white business people? That hasn't solved the problems even for whites. Again, hence Marx's very work in the first place. In his own white context, he's saying capitalism doesn't work for us. And Black capitalists just somehow want to do a Black version and then make and feel like that's going to be successful. Nah, B. King insisted in 1954 that we must forever stand in judgment upon every economic system. More than half a century on, we simply cannot afford to leave in the past the model of a public intellectualism that is genuinely aligned with the Black majority and that is concerned to build it up, and that is concerned to build up a Black public that stands in collective judgment. So so I don't know how we here at BPM are going to overcome this, but again, even the folks I'm having a little
The
fun,
court's top thought leader,
they see themselves and are seen by the Black majority as representing the Black majority. And I know I get it all the time that I'm seen as representing some sort of academic minority or some intellectual or bougie minority. And I'm saying, no, if you look past the messaging and the style, if you'll see that substantively they are representing, offering something very white, very conservative, very reactionary, and very much not about what would develop a Black public that stands in collective judgment. So at a time when thinking and at a time when public thinking and criticism have become almost entirely circumscribed by plutocratic private interests, we find inspiration in an alternative model of leadership that simply cannot be understood apart from the notion of a Black public, or what we might identify, again following Baker, as the life and institutions of the Black majority. How should we understand the nature of this Black public sphere? The discursive space of collective reflection and judgment. That is said better than I ever could, exactly what I've been wanting to ask about and to develop a response to with BPM, and why I'm so proud of what we're endeavoring here. The Black capitalists and the rebranders of Dr. King, etc., they are representing and circumscribed by plutocratic private interests. So how are we going to create a public sphere, a discursive space of collective reflection and judgment? How can we do that when so much effort and energy is funded and supported and algorithmed and advertised into our spaces, but characterized as
the court's top thought leader?
So they even make reference to AdolphReed, who again, AdolphReed remains correct in his analysis, in his critique of the Black public intellectual going back 30 years now. But unfortunately, it almost feels like he's become part of the problem, as he brings his critique of the Black public intellectual and to white liberal conservative, or I would consider neoliberal spaces. While, as we discussed, as we had him on the program here, I think, misrepresenting the Black radical tradition. I thought he did unfairly. But anyway, here, I think he's correct, though. That is AdolphReed. In his famous polemic against spokespersons for the race, AdolphReed argued that the kind of acquiescent black public intellectualism favored by the white establishment, the model represented most keenly in the figure of Booker T. Washington, was a pathological effect of the disenfranchisement specific to the segregation era, as a result of Black Americans' expulsion from civic life. The absence of a more vibrant discursive community. It's almost like, it's almost like Reed is saying intellectually what I'm arguing is happening, and E. Franklin Frazier and others argued long before me, and Abram Harris 100 years ago was arguing happened to Black people economically. That segregation created the mythology of a separate Black economy and a separate Black buying power and a separate Black business world that could exist, a Black Wall Street that could exist, with Black people at the top. And in each case, it creates a situation where the representation of the ideas, the thought leaders, are in fact circumscribed, as these authors said, by advertising and neoliberalism, by plutocratic private interests. So just moving ahead a little bit here, because I don't want to, a lot of fascinating work is done here around dialectics and the philosophy of dialectics and engagement that King himself dealt with, that I'll leave you all to read, and maybe we'll have subsequent discussions here about, but for my limited purpose, I just want to stay in this more, for me, grounded area of how King sought to engage the public sphere, the counterpublic, and this dialectic of ideas and practice. So the authors, a few paragraphs later, pages later, come to talk about Stephen Ferguson, shout out to Stephen Ferguson, who I appreciate, was one of the few who wrote a review of I Mix What I Like some years ago and was critical of it in a positive way. He invited me to his class. He used the book in the class. We had discussions of it. I appreciate and would love to discuss with him this here at some point. But he was critical, saying that, and in fact, it's funny because he was saying that my book was too cultural nationalist, too African-centered. And someone, as you see here, well-grounded in Hegelian dialectics and Marx and et cetera, Ferguson thought that I wasn't materialist enough, which is always kind of funny to me when I think about where I am situated, who says what about me. But I like what he brings, what is said of Ferguson here, and what he brings to this conversation, and how the authors bring him into the conversation. In a philosophically rich essay on King and the tradition of dialectical theory, Stephen Ferguson has argued that ultimately King should not be read as a practitioner of a closed Hegelian dialectic. Ferguson argues that King's thinking was affected significantly by the civil rights movement, and by about 1965, King's dialectics had become a dialectic of negation rather than synthesis. Ferguson argues that King grew less interested in trying to reconcile opposing perspectives within the framework of a liberal democratic public sphere, and increasingly concerned to build up a sort of Black radical counterpublic, an oppositional movement that, as an enemy to capitalism, sought after a reconstruction of the entire society, a revolution of values. So again, what I like what they do with this essay is show how, or this chapter is show how, and really what they do is, and they explain this better than I'm doing, is that King is often quoted revolution of values, or quoted for one of his biblical references or his flowery language, and they lose sight, sometimes I think intentionally, of the fact that he wasn't just talking about an immaterial response or an immaterial problem. So he wasn't just saying we need more love and more integration on some vague level, we need to be around whites and we need to, he wasn't just saying that. He was saying, as I'm going to come to when we conclude, as they do in this chapter, that if you want to get to that material changed world, the very ideas we're working with have to change. And this very idea of capitalism has to be gotten rid of. This idea of a consumer society, a capitalist society, has to be gotten rid of if we're going to get to the kind of world that people say that they want us to have, that we say we want to have. So that's what I'm like where they bring Ferguson in here, because Ferguson is saying, again, I'm too much of a lay person with this, but he's saying that King did not just engage dialectics for this to try to achieve, as is conventionally understood of dialectics, a synthesis between the thesis and the antithesis. That in the struggle between the two creates the synthesis, and that struggle is necessary. What King was saying, or the balance of the two, or some sort of struggle, or the back and forth between the two, creates a synthesis that becomes the solution, which for some almost sounds like a compromise. King was saying no. And as Ferguson points out here, we need to move to a dialectics of negation, where we are, as Maroon Shoatz said, of violence. The solution to violence is not nonviolence. And this is why Dr. King always said nonviolent direct action, because the solution to violence is a direct countervailing force. Not the absence of violence. The absence of violence is not the opposite of violence. It's the opposite. It's the absence of violence. The opposite of violence is the countervailing force. So King is saying, as I understand what is being said here, King is saying, I'm not just looking to synthesize the existence of capitalism and oppression. We need to move to a dialectics of negation. We need to negate capitalism. We need to get rid of it and its logic, if we are going to synthesize to an advanced world. And to do this, at least in part, Black people have to be created as a counterpublic. That is, as I would define it, an organized opposition to the dominant society as it currently exists, not one trying to blacken it or create a Black version of it, or to do well within it, to suggest that we can invest and pool our way within this as a solution to it. That's not what a counterpublic is. That's not what a dialectics of negation is. That's not what Dr. King was advocating. And that's what I love that these authors are making clear for us, and why Dr. King was not a thought leader, because thought leaders are neoliberal deliverers of plutocratic private interests.
The court's top thought leader.
And similar to, and why, and why we developed the hate awards at one point, why, we self-described in my little clique as haters, as I read this here. And what he does, what these authors do with their discussion of King and CLR James is fascinating too. I didn't know much about this. So I'll leave that for you to get to. But as they say here, as CLR James, perhaps the preeminent theorist of the dialectic in the 20th century Black radical tradition, once said, "It is the unbearable nature of contradiction that creates negativity. For if there is no sharp contradiction, there is no movement to speak of, and there is stagnation." That's why we hate. Because we're not, again, paraphrasing George Jackson, we don't hate because, we hate, we want to love, we want to have a great time, we want to enjoy ourselves, but it's the oppression, it's the intentional abuse that creates for us the hate. Or as CLR is quoted as saying here, it is the unbearable nature of contradiction that creates negativity. It's the unbearable nature of this contradiction for me that creates my own feelings of negativity. If there is no sharp contradiction, similar to Sophia Bakari's point about we need to be subjected to the rapier knife of revolutionary criticism. If there is no sharp contradiction, there is no movement to speak of, and there is only stagnation. All right, a little bit more here. Admittedly, even for me, this went longer than I thought it was going to, but this is just such fascinating and rich stuff here. And it's only one chapter of the book that I'm not even covering in its entirety. It's one section of one chapter. But just coming back to this idea again of ideology and practice. By ideology, we refer to a phenomenon in which ideas or values or commitments have become widely held and widely or even universally appealing within a given society, but in such a way that obscures the particular political interests that have fought historically to establish such ideas and that can be said to benefit from their sustained currency. And that's why they come back to Marx and talk about Marx's. I remember reading this myself. Useful here is Marx's memorable formulation that the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. The class, which is the ruling material force of society, is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. So this is why, again, add my name to the long list of people who argue Marx is widely misread and misunderstood, or not read and misunderstood and misinterpreted as only being focused on one aspect. And this is why, as I think the authors bring this point up here, is that as they conclude this chapter, as I said a moment ago, there is no immaterial creation of a world, even in one's mind, that is disconnected from the material conditions that they suffer or must endure. And that if the material conditions don't change, the ideas about society can't emerge. I mean, even they talk a little bit in this chapter about, the simple point of if people don't have time to think and reflect and learn and to build with one another, if you're simply working them too much and keeping them separated through ideas and physical geographic separateness and material separateness, but also intellectual separateness through isolated news and media and isolating news and media, you lose sight of the fact that, then those communities never have time to build and organize and create the world that we should have. But consider also Raymond Geuss, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, Raymond Geuss's formulation, which is perhaps more helpful here for our efforts to expose the broader sort of ideology critique in King's work. The existence of specific power relations in society will produce an appearance of a particular kind. Certain features of society that are merely local and contingent and maintained in existence only by the continual exercise of power will come to seem as if they were universal, necessary, invariant, or natural features of all forms of human life, or as if they rose spontaneously and uncoercedly by free human action. We don't need political organization. We don't need critical analysis. We just need to understand. We just need financial literacy and better.
The court's top thought leader.
Because this is just a universal, necessary, and invariant natural condition we find ourselves in because we have not done right by our economic opportunities. Consider as one example, and one that speaks quite directly to his broader thinking about political economy, King's critique of the bootstrapping ideology that has been and continues to be so central to the traditions of American liberalism. This set piece figures prominently in his speech to the 1199ers. The idea is that any one of us can make it in American society, this apparent land of opportunity, if only we put in some hard work. It's a cruel jest, King countered, to say to a bootless man that he should lift himself up by his own bootstraps. It is even worse to tell a man to lift himself up by his own bootstraps when somebody is standing on his foot. So I might simplify that by saying that this is part of what, in my own work around my own focus on this issue of buying power, that that the bootstrapping is the mythology, is the propaganda. And King is saying how that's a cruel jest to tell people invest better, bank better, pool your resources better, have better financial literacy. What are you talking about? There's a foot on my foot. There's a whole system on my head. Anyway, and this is really, this is where the chapter wraps up. So will I finally. But I think it's a very important conclusion here that speaks again decidedly against today's plutocratic representatives and neoliberal thought leaders, and why again Dr. King is not one. He is not.
The court's top thought leader.
For a reason. Anyway, so in wrapping up, this is the authors bring us to a point that I think is brilliant. I love that they made it, and I would want to emphasize it and bring it more into my own work and to the work we're doing here, both in support of us developing a new public sphere and a Counterpublic, but in understanding the impact of society on the ideas that end up limiting our own ability to struggle and organize against that society. As they write here, it is important to emphasize in ways that Lloyd and other readers of King do not, that capitalism itself, a consolidated market society, is a massively powerful and self-sustaining social movement, a system that reproduces itself through the circulation of commodities. As market actors, we necessarily participate in this movement. As Marx put it, our own social movement has for us the form of a movement of things, and instead of controlling it, we are under its control. Where readers of King's economic views often point out that he was concerned that mass production and consumerism dominate society, that people are focused on buying goods and acquiring wealth in order to buy even more goods, that our employers, government, and social institutions treat us as numbers, as objects interchangeable with other objects, his readers also tend to conclude that what this means for King is simply that the world has forgotten its soul, that in a world where people are objects, morality is forgotten. But what we need to see here, and the emphasis on commodity fetishism helps, as does the fuller theoretical account of racial capitalism, is that the task in front of us is not merely to remember morality, not merely to will ourselves to treat human beings as human beings rather than things. In order to even put ourselves in a position to cultivate this sort of collective memory and will, we first need a wholesale transformation of the social form of domination, what King clearly recognized as the restructuring of the whole of American society. In other words, we need a revolution. I love that they did this. When social relations are mediated by market exchange, Robert says, we find ourselves trapped in a giant collective action problem generating machine. It is not that individuals cannot do exactly what they each want to do, but that they cannot get together and talk about what sorts of things should and should not be done, and what sorts of reasons should and should not count as good reasons. The deliberative space of the democratic public sphere is hamstrung by the fact that we are compelled to reduce ourselves and others to things, to commodities measured by exchange value, and by the fact that we cannot really communicate to learn anything about one another outside this reductionist apparatus of exchange. This materialist streak has the effect of sobering the critical imagination. We have a task, King said, and let us go out with a divine dissatisfaction. The phrase, let us be dissatisfied, a distinctive cry that King leveled time and again, is perhaps more telling than we know. It would seem to imply that our active discontent with the world is somehow constrained, that something threatens to foreclose even our capacity to challenge the workings of a world in which morality has been forgotten. If, to paraphrase King's Ghanaian comrade Kwame Nkrumah, Practice without theory is empty. Then perhaps we need to do some theoretical groundwork before we can enjoy the freedom to cultivate and express our discontent. That is bars. That is absolute.
Now listen, that's called my boy. You know nothing about that.
Practice without theory is, if practice without theory is empty, then perhaps we need to do some theoretical groundwork before we can enjoy the freedom to cultivate and express our discontent. Or put another way, if we share Michael Dawson's interest in rebuilding the Black Counterpublic quickly from the bottom up, as King surely did, then perhaps we must set out, as we argue that King did indeed, to expose the social processes going behind the backs of market actors. For what goes on behind our back cannot be contested. And that's why King is
The
not
court's top thought leader.
So anyway, again, admittedly, this went a little longer than I thought, but that's usually the case. But I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. The reality is again, King continues to be the most known and least understood figure, I think, in human history. Second, maybe only to the historical Jesus Christ.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.